I'm glad they didn't call this movie That's What She Said.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's the first thing when I saw the title. You had mentioned that there's a Pauline Kael doc. I'm like, oh, cool. And I saw the title and I'm like, oh, no.
That's what she said.
Because that's totally like a Steve Carell vehicle from like 5 years ago.
Right, right, right. Yeah.
But fortunately, it is called What She Said, The Art of Pauline Kael. And as much as I didn't like the first part of the title, I love the second part of the title. Because this is a movie about film criticism as an art form, which I think there's film critic did a bad rap, especially now in the days of the internet where we don't matter anymore. And we're all shills and nobody likes our opinions.
That Disney money really helps.
Yeah, well, I see it bought you that sporting new cap, which I like.
That's right.
But no, I confess, Pauline Kael is one of those film critics that I've heard of, ever since I've been interested in film. I've read her very sporadically. I haven't read any of her books or collections, and I keep meaning to. Like, I got all of her books, I think, on my Amazon list. Are you reading?
I keep meaning to read this, and I've had it on my shelf forever. And I keep meaning to read this, and I've had it on my shelf forever. Which is the biography. This is the biography, and the biographer is featured in this movie. One of many people featured in this movie. So yeah, that's me. I grew up with Ebert and Siskel. I heard about Pauline Kael, and I bought a couple books not within the past 5 years, and just haven't gotten around to reading much of her. But this movie definitely made me want to do that.
Yeah, and I think it, like all great documentaries, it makes you want to dig deeper into the subject. In this case, it's one of the first, I would say. They don't make a big deal about this necessarily in the film as much as I thought that they might have, but she's one of the first female film critics and one of the only prominent ones, to have the notoriety that she has, certainly. But she had this ability to, from what I saw in the movie and what little I've read of hers, to pull in this sort of every person voice and to sort of eschew the snobby academic film writing that dominated her day. And that's where she really found her voice. And she had a really wide-ranging and kind of a crazy career. She wrote a couple of essays that got her into some hot water, one of which was not a takedown of Citizen Kane, but an expose of the writer. I think it was Howard Mankiewicz. And that was sort of revelatory to a lot of people that it wasn't all, Orson Welles' brainchild.
Right.
But one of the great things about her was she was a fearless writer and a big personality who, even in the TV interviews that we see with her, she's very, gutsy without being obnoxious. I mean, she's the kind of personality that we just, like, even more, I think, forceful than like Siskel and Ebert when they got into their big, rows on TV. I wish there'd just been a Pauline Kael TV show at some point.
Yeah, I mean, she was very well-spoken and, intellectual, and really just kind of on her feet. She can, basically, I would say almost talk it almost as well as she can write. And you saw that a lot in this movie in clips of television appearances. I think maybe, Dick Cavett or whatever. But I like some of the quotes that unfortunately still ring true today. She was talking about film critics and how they've been received. And she was saying, people don't tend to like a good critic. They tend to hate your guts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and she would even get death threats. Like, back then there's no internet, but, she would get letters saying, I think she recollected that one time somebody wrote how they would kill her and what they would do with all her body parts. It's like, wow. Here's another good quote. If they like you, I think you should start getting worried.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm keeping it real. You're the last guy anyone asked. I mean, we're both, we've both been victims of that before. Not necessarily death threats, but definitely like, how could you like that movie? How could that be your number one? Or how could it be? It's like, okay. And nowadays it's like if we like a Marvel movie, then we're Marvel shills. If we don't like one, then well, those movies are made for fans anyway. And it's like, okay, it's old resounding gong. But back then, she was kind of dealing with the same things. It's funny. I like how she was basically ripping apart Sound of Music. I never thought of it. It's funny because it's kind of like Ebert's. When Ebert writes a review, or when he wrote a review of, like, when he gave a movie that I didn't like 4 stars, those are the reviews I really wanted to read.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all very well written. Some of them he went out in a tangent, like his Watchmen review. But, I think, like, with Kael, at least whenever she breaks down a movie or rips it apart, she's still very well spoken, and I can't necessarily argue with her because she's stating her point of view pretty well.
Yeah, and she's very eloquent. And one of the things that this movie gets across is the idea that she had ambitions to be a writer. She
a screenwriter.
She happened into film criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a weird sojourn back in 1980 with Warren Beatty, where she took a sabbatical from writing film criticism, went out to Hollywood, tried producing, and that didn't work out. But it came across in her writing this wonderful prose where she would bring her own life story into the writing. And I think that influence has been lost and also enhanced in the decades since. Lost in the fact that, or I should say enhanced in the fact that a lot of film critics online especially try and make themselves the story. It's almost like a cross between Hunter Thompson and Pauline Kael. But the problem is nobody can really write like they can. I'll listen to Pauline Kael, or I'll read her describe her own upbringing as it relates to HUD, Paul Newman and that small town existence.
Yeah.
Just listening to that and watching the imagery of the film accompanying it was beautiful. I mean, I feel like someone could just read her work for an hour and a half and show the clips of the movie that she is describing, and that would be a film in itself.
Yeah, I agree.
Very powerful. But yeah, and at the very end of the film, it does talk about the internet era to a certain extent, and how it's harder and harder to get recognized and seen. She definitely, even though it was very tough for her and her daughter, being a single mother back at the time that she was, raising a child and trying to be a bold voice in a predominantly male dominated field, it was a big struggle. So you can kind of see where a lot of that sort of indignant rage and passion for the movies would come out in her writing. My only criticism of the film really is that, similar to that documentary that came out a couple of years ago, the notorious RGB, RBG. RGB has colors. Notorious RBG. That movie was very good at setting up Ruth Bader Ginsburg's career, but not really the person behind all of those decisions. And I feel like in the what she said, we get a lot of Kael's writing. We get a lot of people talking about her writing, but not a lot of insight into her and her life. And that's a conflict for me, because one of the points she drives home is that film criticism is so subjective that there's a reason there's no such thing as like film consensus, really, because everybody brings what they have experienced to the movies with them. And I just don't get the sense of knowing anything more about Pauline Kael as a person, certainly as a critic, but not as a human being after watching this movie.
Well, we do get a little bit of the fact that she had her daughter Gina James with I forget the name of the guy. Anyway, so but they never got she never got married to her daughter's father, and that was kind of like this agreement. And it was interesting that she was raising her daughter as a single mother in a time where that was just kind of unusual. And I think what you're kind of asking for may have come more if they would have maybe asked some more questions of Gina James, her daughter, like what was life like growing up with her, or eventually we learned that she was actually working with Pauline Kael, because Pauline Kael never learned how to type, if you can believe that. And so Gina James would be typing out her reviews for her.
Yeah, and I think there are glimpses into what that life might have been like, and I think you're right. If the movie, I think, had been interested in other things, like getting inside the family life of Pauline Kael, and I don't necessarily want to see something that's invasive, but I'm drawing a lot of inferences about the kind of person Pauline Kael was by these little snippets we get and by her criticism. Yeah. And it's not a very flattering picture, and I'm just kind of want to know, as an audience member, like, I don't know that I really like Pauline Kael as a person, because you're saying she's working with her mother. She's working for her mother. There's a lot of talk about, like, Pauline Kael, the first images we see of her in the film are home movies of her twirling around and drinking and smoking. She has a lot of these socialite parties while her daughter's very young. And, Gina James talks about, well, yeah, when your parent's a critic, they criticize everything. I'm like, oh no, that just sounds miserable.
Yeah, a little too close to home there.
Right, but I don't know if this is a mommy dearest situation or if there was something more tender underneath that.
And maybe if this was called The Life of Pauline Kael instead of The Art of, we'd probably get more of that. And I think I kind of agree with you. It's like I think she's one of those people that, I'd appreciate her art more so than the actual artist. Especially the way she and this was her thing, just if she's going to tear down a movie, she's just going to be brutal. And the way she kind of destroyed the 4-hour something Showa, that was 9
hours.
9 hours. Sorry, 9 hours. Whatever. That was a bit brutal. I could understand some of her point of view, and I understand that, like, just because it's a Holocaust movie doesn't mean it has to be was it sacrosanct, or what's the word? Sacrosanct. Yay us. But I get that. But man, there is a way that you could deliver that message without being kind of cruel or brutal. You could still be blunt, but you don't have to be brutal about it.
Yeah, I did like the message. A movie's theme does not necessarily confer quality onto it. What struck me in combination with that was the David Lean story about the New York Critics Luncheon that he was invited to, and she basically railed on him, and he said, you know what, maybe I should just take a break from making movies. This is the guy who made Lawrence of Arabia. He
was destroyed.
Yeah. And he's actually interviewed in the film, and I wanted to give him a hug.
And it correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like she didn't even like Lawrence of Arabia, right?
No, and I think that's
because she liked T.E. Lawrence and his work, but not what David Lean did with the movie.
Right, and to be a fly on the wall there, because
no kidding.
Because they talk about that incident as the incident, but they don't discuss whether or not it's a back and forth or if it's just her like monologuing at him. Because I would think that someone who made a film like Lawrence of Arabia obviously cared about the story and the source material. So maybe they just had differing point of views that didn't quite mesh. So if Kael thought, like, what if someone liked the musical Cats and then they made the movie that came out recently? I could understand like butchering it, but it's not personal, certainly.
And I would imagine that, David Lean maybe had already known before he was invited there about how she felt about his movies, or Lawrence of Arabia especially. So I don't know, but it is interesting to think that this was a time, and I guess what I mostly appreciate about this movie is it takes you back to a time before the internet. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this is a time where audiences would discover Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde. And it was just huge, because you think it's one movie, then it becomes something else. But then you read her, we're learning in this documentary, you read her review, and it's almost like watching the movie again, but getting even more out of it. That's good writing.
It is, but what you're sidestepping here is the fact that the initial reactions to Bonnie and Clyde were bad. Like, that movie got panned, and it wasn't until she came out with her interpretation that people kind of gave it a second look. Right. And that is the power of great writing, and also the time, because that kind of a thing today would just get lost in 1,000 other think pieces about, the sort of mob mentality of a movie is good or bad. But yeah, I love the stories about her working at the New Yorker, and just this idea of having alternating film critics, head film critics, working for 6 months, and then someone else would take over for 6 months. Is a very interesting idea there. And this is something I think would have been cool to dive into again more if we'd known more about what kind of person Pauline Kael was this great little segment where they talk about the Paulettes. And that's the schools of film critics that were influenced by Pauline Kael, and who she knew and who she sort of cultivated. I believe Ebert was mentioned in that class. So was David Edelstein, Paul Schrader, who's started out as a critic before getting into film. That was this whole idea of she would sort of cultivate these critics, help get them jobs at different media outlets, and then use them as a vehicle to champion films that she championed. So she was almost pre-internet in terms of that kind of a savvy. But again, I don't know if it's hard to tell if this was a deliberate thing, or if it's just that if she was actually ordering these people around, or if they were sort of just so in awe and enthralled and grateful to her that they didn't want to rock that boat or have a perceived slight against her.
Well, it did say that she was always interested in younger people and hanging out with them and learning from them, and that basically falls into discovering them and young talent. So that kind of plays into that. I do like. I do like the segment where it talks about how she loved like American trashy movies, and I think that was. I like the fact that she, had the balls enough to just say, "Hey, I like this, and it's okay to like this." People will make fun of it, whatever. But I think the one book was called "Trash Art and the Movies." Good trash and bad trash. She loved it all. She also talked about like scary movies, and that the horror movies really scare the hell out of me, she said. But I think it sounded like she liked movies like The Exorcist, though. And so it's interesting to see. This documentary makes it seem like she kind of has a type. It kind of describes it as either violent or carnal, or the more bloody the better. But also later on she describes like some of her favorite movies were these kind of unknown silent movies that hardly anybody knew about. So I think if anything, it does show. Yes, she's probably popular for ripping apart movies or praising them, but there's this gray area where she likes all these kind of quirky and kind of maybe lesser known or movies that would typically be disregarded. And so that's kind of cool. I mean, I think we all the more you're a film enthusiast, the more you champion certain movies that either nobody's ever heard about or that just don't get recognized as much. And I think we all have that. Especially, at the end of the year, you look at your list and you're like, man, I guess I'm the only one that's going to put this on my list, and that's fine, but that's also what I see is something that she carried is that I think she felt it's her responsibility to champion certain movies. And that's how I always view our job is to, if there's something that we really like, and it's obviously something that's not being pushed by a big studio or is a franchise, then all the more reason for us to talk about it and champion it and spread the word about it.
Exactly. And, especially in the case of Pauline Kael, you look at some of those undiscovered people that she championed. You're talking about, Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, Spielberg.
Yeah.
These, and she really had an eye for talent, and it really is about a general love of movies, and again, not getting painted into this kind of a corner where you have to praise highfalutin stuff that everybody loves. Just recognize quality in any genre or era of movies, and just be bold about it and tell people, I love this or I hate this, and here's why. And I think that's something that we could really use a bit more of today. I don't know if that's possible because the 74/24 news cycle, and everyone's got an opinion piece and a blog out there. But it really would be refreshing if it was a requirement. If you want to post an opinion about a film, you have to bullet out 5 reasons that you agree or dissent, instead of, oh, it sucks or it was boring, that kind of stuff.
Or at least it should be taught in schools. Even going back far as book reports or whatever. It's like you have to actually have a point of view, and it starts with, did you like it or didn't you? Okay, well, either way, why? And go on to describe why, because that is building a conversation and building communication. And that's really, I think, at the heart of film criticism, is the desire to have a conversation, to discuss movies, and to talk to other people first, other people who like movies as much as you do, but then other people who maybe aren't as into movies, and hopefully you can win them over, about, a certain movie or whatever. But it does start, I think it should start early on about, I always tell my daughter, it's like, okay, you can't just tell me you didn't like it. Let's talk about why you didn't like it. How was it different from the last movie you saw, or how was it different from other movies like it that you enjoy? So yeah, I think she definitely, I'm hoping at some point they will, re-release some of her books. I Made It at the Movies, or whatever.
I lost it.
I lost it at the movies. Yeah, all those innuendo titles were great, but because they're kind of hard to find. I always kind of peruse the film section at Half Price Books and look for Pauline Kael books, but so far those are the 2 I found. It's kind of odd that her work isn't readily available, out there.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a perceived lack of interest or demand, or maybe there's some kind of an anniversary coming up that some publisher is waiting to drop them all. But I think I'm going to use that phrase, now more than ever. We could definitely learn some stuff from Pauline Kael.
Right. Could you imagine the New Yorker putting out a nice hardcover of the best of her work? You put the Lawrence Reivew with Sound of Music, and her review of Blade Runner, I'm sure, is good. But Bonnie and Clyde. But that would be cool.
Yeah, I remember. I think she had passed away by the time I was in high school. But I remember my film class teacher made all of us subscribe to the New Yorker. There was something there was a student discount where you can get a year for $10 or something like that. And he would always talk about Pauline Kael, and we'd have to read the New Yorker film criticism. I think it was different critics by then.
Sure.
But he would talk about Pauline Kael, and he was the one, I think, who first introduced me to the idea of the Bonnie and Clyde film review, and the changing tide. So yeah, it's something that even dopey high school kids who have even a passing interest in film can learn how to appreciate it and experience it in a completely different way. It's ironic that we're talking about a movie that invites open discussion when we've also spent part of this talking about how she shut down discussion, which is completely monologuing with people.
It is funny. One more thing before we end here. What did you think, or did you even notice about some of the voices used in this movie?
Oh man, I wrote that down.
So Rob Garver directed this movie, and he does sorry, Mr. Garver, but he does a really bad, like, stereotypical Woody Allen voice. And it just like, I'm like, ooh, who did that? You know, and I looked it up in IMDb and I was like, ee. But like, we hear Kale in archival footage and that, but whenever we hear somebody read a quote of hers, it's Sarah Jessica Parker. So, you know, I mean, okay, it didn't stand out as I was watching it that, oh, that's Sarah Jessica Parker. But later on when I learned it, I'm like, okay. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's because there's some really good quotes, but they don't have recordings of her actually saying these quotes.
Yeah.
Or they're just written, you know? So I guess I get that, but it is a little odd. There's other voices, actors doing voices for like director George Roy Hill, somebody doing voice for Carol Burnett,
and Gregory Peck is in there. Yeah, there's a whole scene where they read her hate mail.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, just put the letters on screen. I can read it myself. I don't need or just get someone to do a straight voice. I don't need your bad impression.
I felt like I was at the Hall of Presidents in Disney World, you know, like.
Yeah, it was bad news. It was fortunately a very brief spot. Dark spot in an otherwise very bright film. A film that is actually opening tomorrow, Friday. That would be January. Oh my gosh, what's the date?
10th.
January 10th. Yes, 2020. At the Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago. And possibly elsewhere, I'm not sure, but there'll be a link to tickets and all that stuff in the description, so definitely check that out. This is a film that I think will be perfect for Film Center because you can get people there who are going to go to the Film Center who love movies. It's named after a film critic, and I could just see some great discussions happening in that beautiful like lobby and seating area afterwards. That'd be almost something to film, you know, those passionate debates.
Oh yeah, and at the end they could say, "That's what she said."
No, they can't because that's a terrible idea. A terrible almost title for this movie. Sorry, Mr. Garver, but yikes. But
it is a little bit more interesting than just the art of Pauline Kael.
Yeah. Oh, they could have called it Kale in comparison. No. Anyway, Kale.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, it might be better written down or forgotten.
You know what's interesting about the title is maybe it's my insecurity and my lack of confidence that comes in waves. I rarely think of what I write as art, and I know I don't have delusions of grandeur that I'm you know as good as Kael or Ebert or anything, but I just I try to do my best, but I never think about what I'm doing as art. And I've been told that people like my work fine, but you know how it is. You're your own worst enemy and blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting to think of film criticism as art. Now, I've appreciated film criticism and I've been impressed by it and moved by it. And, I like reading other reviews. But there's definitely written pieces that rise above. And so I guess that's where she falls into. But yeah, this idea of art, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's something I think we all kind of deal with that on our own personal level, but it's hard, especially in this climate, because as I mentioned, film critics aren't taken seriously by probably 90% of the populace right now. Certainly not the way they were perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, or even in Kael's day, her heyday.
Right.
But we are practitioners. We are pouring ourselves out. We are getting better. There's technique. I mean, if you look at it's kind of like goes back to our song lyrics. Art is poetry art, or is it just writing? Art isn't just sculpture or putting ink on a page or splattering paint on a canvas. Music is art. It's all art. Some of it's bad. Some of it's transcendent. But if it's all about expression, then there's no reason that you can't think of what you're doing as an art form. I wouldn't recommend going out and getting an ascot and a cigarette holder and telling people you're an artiste, but go ahead and believe it because it's true.
That's an idea. We should try that sometime. We should wear ascots and robes and
Yeah, they'll be for the new podcast, Ascots for Asshats. But on that note, yeah, I was not knocking your cap. I was just
all right.
Gotcha. But yeah, well, thank you very much for talking about this movie, and for anyone out there who's watching this, go see it. Like I said, it's playing at the Siskel Center. It may be opening other places. I'm sure you can find out more information probably at whatshesaid.com or something like that. If there is, I'll leave that.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, don't go to that website because it might be porn. I will find out the actual website for the film and put it in the description.
And you could post my kale avocado salad recipe. It's really good.
Will not do it.
Okay.
I will critique it, but I won't post it. So on that note, have a great night, sir, and we'll talk again soon.
All right.